See, as usual, there have been a few little hiccups this morning. I look forward to the day when I don't have to give that disclaimer, when I can just say that everything went perfectly and it was so easy. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it goes extraordinarily well. And I'm hopeful that eventually that becomes normal. But unfortunately, right now, it seems like every time I go to broadcast something, there is some kind of hiccup. All right, I think I've got everything good to go. I am. Seems like my audio's working all right. Okay, it's 11:06, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Um, this is this is live critique broadcast. My name is Trent Reynolds, and I'm here today to critique some artwork. I got some submissions that I would like to talk about and I think might be instructive. If you would like your work critiqued on this broadcast, you can email me. Email me images at Dabbleon, Dabbleon, at gmail.com. You can also access information about my classes and future critique groups. You can contact me directly if you would like to talk to me directly in person about your work or schedule a time for that. At dabbleon.com, dabbleon.com. That's where you'll find information about all the things that I'm working on. I've got a color class that I'm working on that should be available soon, a color class for painters, and as well as a bunch of other ideas, including a podcast, a new podcast that I'll be releasing hopefully very, very, very soon. If you're not already familiar, I already have a podcast that's well worth, in my opinion, taking a listen to. It is Room in the Trees, Room in the Trees, and you can find more information about that at roominthetrees.com. And with that, let me get right into the image that I'm talking about today. So let me zoom in a little bit. Aha. In all the hustle, I unplugged my Wacom tablet. So I need to get that plugged back in. There's this kind of frantic moment when I think I've got everything in order right before I hit go live. And then all of a sudden something doesn't didn't go live. Anyway, so I just start unplugging things and plugging things in. Anyway, so this is a painting. I wasn't told how large the scale of the painting is, but I have some guesses. Probably medium-sized easel painting, so in the neighborhood of like, 16 by 20, I would say something like that. Just based on a couple things, on brush stroke size, just based on experience, knowing kind of the general brush size that people tend to reach for on average, and knowing a little bit about this person's work. So I would say 16 by 20-ish, or maybe a little bit larger. And I believe this is a work in progress. So what we've got is a woman's face here in the center. The bottom of the face is visible, and then there is an eye that's kind of obscured or covered up by a semi-transparent piece of fabric. So looking at this, there's a couple things that occur to me right off the top of my head, and I And I think there is one thing in particular that I would like to focus in on because I think it's something that a lot of us care about and a lot of people struggle with. But before I get to that, I want to just first look at what's happening on a foundational level. All right. So if we disregard what the subject matter is, it's a woman's face being shrouded by some kind of piece of fabric, right? If we disregard what the subject matter is and just look at how this rectangle, right, the rectangle of this painting is being divided up, right? How it's being split up into separate parts. And let's look at it just in terms of its visual foundation, like the building blocks that she has established that comprise the overall composition. So this is what I've done. I've taken kind of the big shapes. If we look past all the brushwork, the texture, the details of the eyes, nose, mouth, the folds in the fabric, there's a lot of busyness going on there. But underneath all of that busyness, there are these undercurrents, right? These big shapes, these big divisions of space. And those are the things that are really going to have the most impact on how we read the image, how we interact with or interpret the image. So what I've done here is I've just kind of gone through and picked out those big shapes and filled them in with. So I'm going to kind of go back and forth and just kind of filled them in. Here's semi-transparent with solid colors, so we can see beyond the surface noise, all the texture of that of the painted information, and see better what's happening on that undercurrent level, right? So this is kind of what's happening. Those big shapes kind of filled in with a color that more or less represents that overall shape. Okay. I think it could be said that there is another implied division of space. And if I can zoom in here, it could be said that there's another implied division of space right here. I've got to figure out the keyboard shortcuts for changing these settings. All right, so there's a pretty strong vertical line happening right down here. So it could be said that this is kind of another subdivision on that large foundational scale. And then it could also perhaps be said that these lines right here imply maybe another division on this side. So maybe we could even make even more subdivisions than the ones that I've chosen. But I think these ones are, to me, what are the strongest at, again, at that kind of foundational level. So let's just look at this. Is this an interesting composition? Does it work visually? Am I interested in the shapes? Am I interested in how that rectangle is being divided up? And I think the answer is yes. I think just at that foundational level, it's already a fairly compelling composition, just in terms of how these big shapes are dividing up the rectangle. I like to. It is an oversimplification, but I think a useful one, to say that um, it is easy enough, or perhaps it is enough, to just focus on, when we're looking at this large kind of foundational layer of our image making, just to focus on making variety. So right now, what I mean by that is we have this big black shape right there. We have this medium size red shape right there. And then we have a slightly smaller set of shapes, maybe right here and right here. And then we get to this kind of sliver shape that is more of a line, perhaps, than a shape, although it's a shape too. And then a small shape. So we've got a really wide range of just sizes of these divisions of space of the overall rectangular composition, right? There's variety there. Rather than what she could have done, and what is most often done if we're not really paying attention and we're just kind of going by default, what we tend to do is divide that overall composition up into even symmetrical spaces. So what might have happened, and a lot of times does happen, which is why I'm bringing it up here, is she put the face shape right here. She put that fairly, pretty close to right in the center. We can see the distance between the left and right side of the face and the side of the composition is pretty much the same on both sides, right? So that's already creating a sameness on both sides of that face, a symmetry, which is not tend going to be the most interesting. But she broke up that symmetry by simply draping these two kind of fabric shapes across from one side. If she were to have, for example, made this fabric drape down so that the bottom loop of the fabric was right in the middle and then it looped back up so that it was at the same place on the other side. Go back and do that in a different color so you can see what I'm talking about here. So if she would have done draped that fabric in such a way where it kind of looped down here and then came back up here on the other side so that it was kind of reinforcing that symmetry. And we have these two lines down here on the sides that are pretty close to the same. And then she could have done the middle of this fold right here, right in the center. And again, it's this default behavior that we all have. I see it all over the place. Even experienced artists, if we're not paying attention to how we're dividing up our composition, we tend to want to make everything symmetrical and the same, which makes sense, right? There's a logic to that, but the problem is it's just not very interesting, and it doesn't make the most compelling visual experience, and it doesn't communicate emotion. It's kind of stale and stiff, and there's not movement, there's not asymmetry, there's not a way to, or kind of a set of cues as to how to move around. There's no movement, right? It's all kind of locked in on this symmetry. So I wanted to point that out because I think it's really important. In this case, she's gotten a lot right. She's starting with a really strong foundation. Okay, so once again, I'm going to go back. This is kind of the foundation. Then what I wanted to point out here is, well, maybe before I get beyond that, I think she might want to think about this black space down here at the bottom could possibly be broken up in like one more time. It feels a little bit monolithic, like it's a big solid shape down there at the bottom, and perhaps could use another large division. Now, I don't know exactly what that might look like. I do like these kind of curvy fabric types of divisions. And then we got kind of the contour of the face, which is a nice soft division. You could reinforce those kind of draping that are happening all in a similar direction, or a lot of them in a similar direction by having a division that goes down in there. I don't know if it's another piece of fabric in the foreground. You have another kind of draping thing happening that goes the opposite direction. So maybe you could mirror that a little bit by having another kind of draping thing. It could be part of her clothing. It could be just an abstract division of space that doesn't necessarily tie into something representational. But again, I would think about how you might be able to break up this space a little bit more. In If we decrease the opacity there, you are kind of doing that or suggesting a larger division by having these marks that help maybe divide that up in that area, and that's not bad. That's kind of a rule of thirds vertical right there, which could be interesting. But again, I don't think we need more busyness. We don't need no more brush strokes. What we could probably use down here is a stronger kind of foundational shape, right? And I think actually that's not a bad way to go either right there. This kind of echoes or is a variation. It's a little bit more up and down, and it kind of implies or ties into where we might expect to see the neck. So maybe it would also double as suggestion of more of her form. So that might not be a bad idea right there. Also, while you're thinking about how to divide up that space or where that division might happen, again, be careful that you don't just, divide it right down the middle or do it equally on both sides. So we end up with this symmetry that kind of is counterproductive or doesn't help or emphasize the movement that you're creating with these other shapes and other divisions. And also, don't want to make shapes that are redundant or the same size, Anyway, so a lot of good things happening just on a structural level, on that base floor, on that foundation. What I wanted to bring up today is in terms of things ways that I think this could be improved. This has to do more with something I feel like we all run into. First is when you're establishing that foundation of large divisions of space. I think it's in your benefit, and it's helpful just as you're constructing your image to block those in generally without too much texture, without too much of this busyness of brushstrokes, right? These details can make it difficult for you unless you really have your composition nailed down before you start painting. All these little brush marks can make it difficult to see how the image is functioning on that foundational level, right? It's as if we're building a house and we've poured the foundation, but then we're wearing dirty goggles, or I don't know, maybe this isn't the right metaphor, but it just makes it more difficult to see if we have a strong foundation, right? Whereas I think if you were to use a larger brush, more paint, block it in more generally without a whole lot of that extra brushwork, you'd be able to see more clearly how strong the foundation is. I think there's another thing just that a lot of us get into where we use a small brush because that's what we're used to using, and that's what we have on hand, right? Which makes sense. So you use the tools that you have, but it's worthwhile always considering whether or not you've got the right tool for the job, right? I can't tell you how many times I've seen students, even though they have large brushes in their box, they have one, but they bring out a tiny little detail brush to fill in these large areas of canvas, right? Not only is that creating a ton of more work for yourself, that's going to take a lot more time, it's locking you into too focused an area of your painting before you're ready for it, right? So don't be afraid to grab that big brush if the area that you're addressing on a canvas is large, right? Use the right tool for the right job. So in this case, these shapes that she's blocking in, outside of these details of the lips, the nose, and the eyes, these shapes, look at how wide they are, right? These are big, wide shapes. And look at how big these brush strokes are. Her brush is probably about, I don't know, 3/4 inch or maybe an inch, probably not though. It kind of depends again on how large her canvas is. I'd guess around 3/4 of an inch. So she could be using like an inch and a half or a 2-inch brush easy, or maybe even bigger. If you've got a big old like 3-inch brush or 4-inch brush, that could be used to block in these big areas of color very quickly, and get those large divisions in and recognize whether or not you've got a strong foundation before you start bringing in these smaller brush strokes. The other thing about small brush strokes like this is they feel tentative. They feel fussy or not confident, right? When you go over, I mean, you can almost imagine what it looks like watching her paint, or I can. It's a repeated motion going kind of over and over the same areas multiple times. The way the brushstrokes are kind of evenly distributed. We've talked about evenly distributing things. Feels like there might be a little bit of autopilot going on there, and maybe using these brushstrokes not as a purposeful way to communicate something, but rather as just kind of autopilot. I'm just filling in this area or creating an overall texture, right? So there's a consistency, there's a sameness in the way those brushstrokes are being applied, and the way that they're being gone over and over and over feels like it lacks confidence, right? With anything, with any activity, when we see somebody kind of going over and over and over again, there's that like we can sense that they're not confident just to do it one time and be done, right? So I think this is with a lot of us. Using a big enough brush to address the area, the size of the area that we want to address, and then not fussing, using enough paint to cover that much real estate, to cover that much surface area. That's a big problem. You gotta squeeze enough paint out there to address the area to cover, just practically speaking, we gotta cover that surface area with the right amount of paint, and then not going over and over and over again. So what if we are lacking confidence? What if we are not quite sure and we're just kind of tentatively trying different colors and trying to get the right feel of folds, or we're experimenting with a new texture? That's fine, right? We can experiment. And the nice thing about working with acrylic or oil, I'm not sure in this case, I would guess acrylic, but I know this person uses oil on occasion, so it might have been a layer of acrylic with oil on top. But I'm seeing a lot of kind of dry, brushy marks that are picking up the surface of the canvas, and usually that means acrylic. So I would guess acrylic, but it might also just be using oil with a lot of medium or not enough paint. Um, so regardless, the nice thing about using oil and acrylic is that they're opaque media, right? So if we do a bunch of these experimental or tentative marks, we can always cover them up. So in this case, what I would recommend is if you get to this point where you've just got a lot of stuff going on, a lot of noise, a lot of texture, a lot of brush strokes that are redundant and kind of creating unnecessary visual noise, I would say get a bigger brush and take one area, say like this area right there, and where there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, where there are like 10 strokes, see if you can't do that in 2 strokes. Right, cover that whole area up, mix these 2 colors, you kind of got this light red and then this dark shadow, maroon, kinda neutral purpley red happening right there. So mix up those 2 colors and see if you can just take a bigger brush and swoop in, cover that whole area with just 2 or 3 strokes, right? Replace all of that visual noise with those confident strokes and then be done with it. Don't go back and try to blend them or touch them up, right? There's this tendency we want to have just to keep on fussing with stuff. We can fix the fussiness of these marks by simply covering them up with more confident brush strokes. And in fact, that's probably what I would recommend here. Is I see just a lot of noise, a lot of um, that I don't think is aiding you in this case. There's a lot of sameness in the way you're distancing brushstrokes from each other, the distance, the width of the brushstroke, that I don't think really accurately represents, or at least my expectations of what fabric folds would look like. Fabric folds would probably one or maybe one, two, or three would be kind of larger, and then maybe there would be smaller creases in there, so we'd have more a sense of volume of fabric. Um, and it would just be more visually interesting to have more variety instead of this kind of static, chaotic energy happening with all these individual brushstrokes. And then, of course, the same down here. I feel like there's a lot of texture, there's a lot of busyness and visual noise that isn't necessarily helping um, your subject matter. Come back with a bigger brush, go in with a more confident brushstroke, and just where there's 15 brushstrokes, cover it up with one big confident brushstroke and leave it alone, right? I don't have any images up right now, but John Singer Sargent is somebody who was a master of the master of this. Anecdotally, I remember, and I did not read this firsthand, so this might be totally wrong. But I remember hearing a story that, John Singer Sargent would load up a brush with different colors of paint, and he would spend hours just preparing one stroke with the right amount of colors and positioning on the brush, and then he'd go in and just make one swoop, and there would be, 3 or 4 different colors that would blend and create the right shapes and texture, and he'd just nail it, right? And if you look closely at his paintings, it is kind of a wonder to look at how much he was able to accomplish in one seemingly one stroke of the brush, right? Anyway, so the way we're applying paint communicates confidence or hesitance or us being unsure. So think about that, right? You want, especially in this case, I think the subject matter wants to be confident. I feel like wants to be strong, wants to be project, um, strength and not that kind of tentative feel of obsessively kind of going over and going over and over strokes. Anyway, I think enough said about that idea. I think you all get it. So as I was saying earlier, we could perhaps use the neck or a suggestion of the contour of her neck and shoulder to divide up this background space a little bit, right? To create this, maybe further divide up this big black area shape, right? That might be a good way. Or a suggestion of, another drape of fabric coming down here in the foreground, or even just in a corner, something to again divide up this black area a little bit more. All right, and then the last thing that I wanted to say here is focal point. What is the focal point? So she has created focal point in a couple different ways. One is by placement. She's put the shape of the head right in the center of the composition. We've got high value contrast between this white of the skin and then the black background. So a lot of our attention is going to this shape in here. Let me go back to that green. That was a good loud green that was very visible. So we've got this white shape that's happening down here next to all these dark colors of red and black, not so much this white over here, but that's making this area really stand out, that large shape, not to mention all the facial features that we are immediately going to lock in on as human beings, right? So nose and mouth, we're definitely going to pick up that this is a face. It's positioned, that overall shaped face is positioned right in the middle of the rectangular composition in the middle horizontally, right? Um, so that's where I would say my eye goes right here to the nose and mouth. Um, I don't know if I feel like that's the intention. Maybe I go here first, which is the intention, and then I'm kind of pulled up to this less visible, more obscured eye up here. We're always gonna be attracted to eyes. Eyes are always gonna be, a natural focal point just psychologically. We're so, uh, in tune with the eyes especially. But I think I would probably want to de-emphasize this area a little bit more. I don't know if you accomplish that by just simply making the skin a little bit darker. Let me see if I can, do that real quick. And let's change the opacity here. I'm going to change that to a multiply layer. Whoop, that's not the color I want. So what if I just make this skin tone a little bit darker? Maybe I suggest a shadow being cast on the face from these drapes of fabric, right? So it starts to create in front of a spatial relationship with the fabric in the background. That could also be used, and that will kind of give some distance and push the face back a little bit so it doesn't feel like it's sitting quite so much on the surface. I don't know if this is hair on the left side of her, or my left side, her right, of her face, but maybe that hair is casting a more of a shadow on her face. Perhaps there could be more of darkness down at the bottom of her face. Again, trying to find ways to maybe de-emphasize this so it doesn't pop out so much. Making it darker and less contrasty with the background will help do that. And then I don't know, I think maybe just something more of a zip, something. Let's see, I'm gonna try to smooth that out a little bit. Something to just bring us into that eye a little bit more, I think would be helpful. And that wouldn't necessarily have to be on the eye itself. It could just be like a little bit of saturated color in the curtain or the fabric, around the eye. That would help guide us into that area. Right? So the fabric gets a little bit more saturated or red here around the eye, and that's gonna help us, kind of gravitate up there. I probably would make a little bit more contrast, make the eye a little bit clearer in the background, than it is. Maybe that would be enough, but it feels like, it might be a little bit too obscured for me to really arrive there. So I would say still, I'm kind of primarily first going to this foreground area with the nose and the mouth, and this feels like a gash or it feels not entirely friendly. The way this mark is obscuring the front of the face there, but finding ways to de-emphasize this big white shape of the face and then emphasize the eye a little bit more so we can make that jump from all of this information up into the eye a little bit more readily. All right. So I think that is all I have to say for today about this image. Just to review, one, the foundation is great. The foundation's really nice. I think, you've divided up the composition in really strong ways. So the design, the way you've organized those shapes is really strong. I would go back and I would go over some of this texture and this busyness and brushwork and cover it up with stronger, bigger strokes, more confident strokes. Where there's 15 small brush strokes, cover that up with one big brush stroke. You can go in and blend a little bit, but try to avoid the appearance of all those little tentative swipes of the brush, and try to come in with something more confident. I think your image will benefit from that. I would think about how to divide up this big black area up, maybe one more time into one more sub shape, and then clarify the focal point a little bit, or the way that we're supposed to read the image, by de-emphasizing this big white shape a little bit, by darkening it somewhat, maybe creating some shadows being cast from some of these foreground shapes, and then maybe strengthen the contrast on the eye up there so we land there a little bit more, and just have a little bit more to lock in on. That we could possibly have a little bit of saturated color in the eye. I don't know if these are brown eyes or what color they might be, but I'm gonna guess brown. So maybe just a little bit of it's not the right color. I've got a multiply layer on, so I'm not gonna do that. But maybe like a little suggestion of color in that eye might help strengthen that, in addition to darkening the pupil a bit. Right. That's starting to just grab my attention a little bit more. I mean, obviously she wants to make she's kind of needs a balance of obscuring, having that the fabric come in front of the eye, but not so much that we can't see it at all. All right. And I think that's it. Hopefully you got all that. Um, anyway, lovely image. The face is nice. I like the mystery. I like the idea of obscuring the eye somewhat. That's always going to be a psychologically compelling imagery for people. And then I'm interested in um, this big kind of it's not violent, but there's an aggressiveness to the way this black mark is applied and the way that it's on top of the face. And especially kind of feels like its origin is the nose or nostril. It kind of feels like it's a bloody nose or it's a gash or it's a wound. It feels like a wound. Anyway, I don't know if that was intentional, but I'm intrigued. It feels um, very dramatic. So that is good. Maybe one thing that I'll do here before I wrap up, I mentioned earlier, and I might be able to do this very quickly. So I would again make some of the let me reduce that. Make some of these folds in the fabric larger because typically that's how fabric is. It has, it rarely kind of folds into equally thick volumes, right? Usually you've got one or two big folds and those kind of get divided up, especially as they kind of go back into space. Let me get more of a highlight on that foreground. So that might not be quite the right, I mean, a little bit more saturation in there. Right. And then as it goes away from your light source, you got to get clear on the light logic. The highlights are going to get a little bit darker. Maybe something a little bit more saturated in the shadow area. Right, so you see how I've got, like, one big fold here, and maybe those are a little bit too evenly distributed. I have kinda mini little creases and stuff that happen in there. It's a lot of cool stuff that fabric does. With all of these, even if you're making this up out of your head, it is worth having some kind of visual reference. So actually a piece of fabric actually that you're looking at or a photo of fabric that you can have off to the side. Um, Having that visual reference can be extremely helpful. And then, little folds and clumps of fabric. But hopefully you get the idea. So instead of having a lot of evenly spaced little creased fabrics, we have a sense of this three-dimensional volume. That's going to help create more of a sense of space and also help imply a relationship between this fabric and the face that's behind it, and kind of a spatial relationship. All right, so I think that is that's where I'm going to stop for today. Thank you so much for sending in that image, sending the painting. Um, and thank you for being willing to share a painting that is in progress, right? It's a vulnerable place to be, right? When you're not quite confident, it's not finished. It's not something that you're necessarily happy with or you feel like represents your best in the moment. Um, but I think it can be so beneficial to see that and talk about that, not just for you, but for the rest of us, right? We all learn from recognizing that somebody else has the same problems that I have, and also, just being able to see potential solutions to the problems that we're all inevitably going to face. So I really appreciate you going out on a limb and letting us talk about an unfinished painting. I hope more of you will do that. Don't hesitate to send something in. I don't need to say your name in the broadcast. Nobody needs to know who you are. I hope you'll share what you're working on now. I think there's a lot of benefit to all of us being inspired, knowing that other people are currently facing these things or working on these problems um, and just out there making work, right? Um, so send any images that you would like me to talk about. Sooner is better, so I can get prepared to talk about them in the next broadcast. I broadcast each week at the same time on Thursday, 11 a.m. I think we're in daylight time, PDT. Um, and I usually try to keep it to 45 to an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. If you are interested in classes or any of the other things that I'm working on, or if you'd like to schedule a personal critique with me, you can find out more information or reach out to me through my website at dabbleon.com, dabbleon.com. I am working on setting up small critique groups, which I will host and oh, I'm forgetting the word. I will host and facilitate. Um, Space will be limited on those critique groups. If you're interested in that, definitely sign up for my email list so you get information about that when it comes out. Um, or reach out to me again, dabbleon@gmail.com. Hope you have a fantastic week. Get out there, make some artwork. I'm actually super excited to get back to the studio. I'm in the middle of I just had 5 3 by 4 foot panels made for me, and I'm doing these big resin pieces with photograph and anyway, I just got these 2 huge photographs um, applied to these panels, and I'm excited to get back to the studio to work on them. So I hope you're out there making artwork as well. And with that, I will bid you adieu and see you all next week if I can turn myself off here. All right. Have a good week, everyone. We'll see you later. Bye.